Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razum Pereira. US President Donald Trump said on January 21st that he was watching and closely following the developments between India and Pakistan on Jammu and Kashmir. Trump, who had met Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, described him as a very good friend. A White House statement quoted Trump as saying, "We are working together on some borders and we are talking about Kashmir and the relation to what is going on with Pakistan and India. And if we can help, we certainly will be helping." The US President sparked a controversy in 2019 when he claimed that Prime Minister Narendra Modi had asked him to mediate on the Kashmir issue when they met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Japan's Osaka. Trump made the statement while meeting Khan at the White House. This claim was rejected by the Indian government. India has maintained that the Kashmir issue can only be discussed bilaterally and is not open to a third-party intervention. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze President Trump's eagerness to help on the Kashmir issue. Joining me on the program today are Prabhu Dayal, former ambassador, Professor Swaran Singh, chairperson, Center for International Politics, JNU, and Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you. What do you make of this latest comment by US President Donald Trump? This is probably the fifth time in the last 5 months where he has said that he wants to help with regards to Kashmir.
Well, I see Trump's remarks and in fact his meeting with Imran Khan in the context of America's interests in the South Asian region. America wants to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, and for that it needs to work out an agreement with the Taliban. And for working out this agreement, Pakistan's role is going to be very important. On the other hand, Pakistan's most important interest at the present time is to get out of the Financial Action Task Force grey list, because being on that grey list is hurting Pakistan considerably. The next meeting of the Financial Action Task Force is going to be held in Beijing on the 16th of February, and Pakistan is doing its level best to lobby support with countries that matter so that it can exit the grey list. And it has been engaging in talks with the United States in that context also. Very significantly, a very senior US diplomat, Alice Wells, who's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, visited Islamabad just a couple of days back, and on Monday she made certain remarks which indicated that America is trying to be helpful to Pakistan. She said that on the basis of whatever presentations were made to her, she was fairly satisfied that Pakistan is doing what is required to be done to exit the grey list. Now, there were questions asked as to whether there was a quid pro quo for getting Pakistan's support in the context of Afghanistan. Clearly, the two sides are trying to work out a deal. President Trump is known for making deals. And my understanding is that he is engaging in talks with Pakistan and trying to be as nice as possible, calling the Pakistani Prime Minister his great friend and saying that US-Pakistan relations have never been better than they are now, to indicate to the Pakistan side that America is prepared to go along towards helping Pakistan in return for the helpful role which Pakistan should play in the context of an agreement in Afghanistan. So, rather than be worried about this remark which Trump made, in which particularly he said, if we can help, we are willing to do that, indicating that his stance remained the same. He had earlier, after the meeting with Imran Khan on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September, indicated that he would be happy to mediate only if the governments of India and Pakistan both asked him to do so. So more or less there is consistency with his present statement that we can help. If we can help, we are willing to do that. But in reality, he is not terribly concerned about helping to resolve the Kashmir issue. Though, when he said we are talking about Kashmir and with relation to what's going on with Pakistan and India, it is the terrorist activities which Pakistan is waging against India, and because of which it is on the grey list. And I think we should do everything possible to keep it just there.
Right.
And if it requires our taking up these issues with the United States of America, we should do so. Because surely Pakistan is engaging in diplomacy with Trump and with Alice Wells and everyone in the American establishment to convince them that they are doing what is required to be done to exit the grey list. We should make it clear that they should remain on the grey list.
Right.
But I would not be too worried about any attempts by Donald Trump to mediate between India and Pakistan, except to the extent that he should remain convinced that Pakistan is not doing what is required to be done to curb terrorism from its shores.
Okay, all right. That having been said, a couple of points to be taken forward, Professor Swaran Singh. He goes on to call Pakistan a very good friend of his, and like the ambassador very rightly pointed out, that the relationship between the US and Pakistan has never been better, is what he suggested. Historically and traditionally, we've seen that the US and Pakistan have been very, very good friends. So at some level, should this concern us?
I think if you notice that he said he fell in love with Kim Jong-un when he was meeting the North Korean leader, his language is usually generous. So are his gestures. There are two ways to look at Trump's speeches or policies. One, you could look at it as him being a misguided missile, as we have forgotten things by now what he said yesterday. Or there is a possibility of some method in madness in his strategies, and I am inclined to take the second. As Ambassador just now said, his priorities are very clearly directed towards his re-election. Returning from Afghanistan is an important element. Staying on leadership in terms of initiatives that United States would like to take, whether domestic or international. For instance, at home, parallel to what he was talking in Davos, on 13th this month, there is a US Congressional Research Report which has come out, which is giving contrarian view, saying that Pakistan does not have credibility, and particularly after August 5, of doing anything when it comes to engaging or countering India in case of Kashmir. And even diplomatically, it says it is isolated, and therefore attempts are limited to diplomacy. Who's the closest friend of Pakistan? In fact, the 17-member team from Pakistan is today in Beijing, trying to convince Beijing, which is now the chair of FAFT, to give them more time before they are pushed into a blacklist. China itself doesn't have a great reputation for human rights issues. Now, in that backdrop, if you see Donald Trump's strategy, you should notice the difference between July and today. For instance, throughout, his direct India-focused criticism has been almost not there. He's been talking in very generic terms of ensuring peace in the region, respecting human rights in the region, etc., etc. And most important, if you notice the July meeting with Imran Khan in the US, the mention of mediation was made. Mention of resolving issue of Kashmir was made. And if you look at what he's saying this Tuesday, yesterday, he's talking of we will be willing to help if we can in reducing the tensions between India and Pakistan, which could be trade related, culture related, anything related. So language has become over a period of time, thanks to perhaps Howdy Modi of Houston in September. Language has dissipated over a period of time, but compulsion of engaging Pakistan stays. Compulsion of co-opting India vis-a-vis China stays. So in that sense, I think he's talking of in a fairly limited maneuverability, where he's drifting his language to say that he still wants to talk of these issues, but is not willing to appear like pushing India in any direction. So expecting that he's also thinking of his visit here, possibly maybe next month or a little later. I think the consciousness of President Trump on how far to push India on issue of Kashmir is very clear. And his sort of compliments of, describing Imran Khan as his friend, etc., I don't think that should be taken in isolation, because every leader he meets obviously is his great friend. He arrives at great agreements with each of them. And if you look at the overall language he uses in his interactions, I think here he was fairly restrained than he usually is.
Sure. Okay, and if you look at the statement a little more closely, Professor Pant, he speaks about, if we can help, we will certainly help. That is one of the lines. And secondly, he said, if there is peace in Kashmir, America would have had a role to play in it. Now, what do you make of these statements?
Well, one, I think there is a clear recognition now of the limits of American power in the region, and that what America can do vis-a-vis the dispute. So, if we can help is a recognition that which recalls his earlier explanation that only if India and Pakistan want, we will be happy to mediate. Which I think is an acknowledgement that he perhaps through his advisors has a better understanding of what the problem actually is. If you recall his initial statement, it was very outspoken. Mediation, Prime Minister Modi has asked me to mediate, and so after that we have seen a gradual recalibration of his statements. And this statement, I think, certainly is a recognition that this only if the two sides want will there be any movement as far as America is concerned, and we will be happy to help that process. The other is, Kashmir in some ways holds that kind of sanctity for Pakistan, which I think at this point in time, if you look at their entire diplomatic campaign, it's almost for the last since India revoked Article 370, it has been around Kashmir. So clearly now there is a lot of pressure on Pakistani interlocutors to say or do things on Kashmir, especially those where there is a prospect of a possible quid pro quo. So the larger understanding, it seems to me, is very much along the lines that, look, there is that Americans are now sensitive to what the Pakistanis want on Kashmir, and clearly if there is stability in Kashmir, America would like to have a role. America would like to make a claim that it did something about it, at the same time recognizing the challenge that they face. So I would think that by and large this has been a better performance from Mr. Trump than we have seen in the past, given the sort of tightrope walking that he has to do between India and Pakistan. Clearly there are issues on the table which I think even at this point are beyond his comprehension, in the sense of that he will be visiting India. So how will he manage this engagement? Because he will have to showcase two things. On the one hand, he would like to go back to his base and say, look, we have withdrawn from Afghanistan. But that may or may not happen given the circumstances on the ground. On the other hand, a successful visit to India does enhance his credibility at this point in time within the domestic political landscape, where he's isolated, where he's being impeached, the process of impeachment has started, and there are a lot of negatives around his personality. A successful visit to India delivers a lot to him. So he has to maintain that, and he has also to see what can he get out of an Imran Khan government, which is virtually on its knees on various issues. So to me it seems that the larger chessboard that is being laid out in front of America, they are looking at it from a perspective of what in the short term they can get from Mr. Khan, and they also understand the vulnerabilities that Mr. Khan faces in terms of challenging, as I think earlier was pointed out. Americans are under no illusion about the ability of Mr. Khan to deliver, let alone move forward on the issue of Kashmir. They also know he's isolated. They also know that his campaign to make Kashmir a big issue has faltered in a major way. And on the other hand, India gradually has been able to remove restrictions in Kashmir, make Kashmir issue more transparent, has been taking a lot of interlocutors to Kashmir. So there is a larger roadmap which is working in India's favor at this point.
Right.
Whereas Pakistan's case is increasingly getting shattered. The kind of grand pronouncement that it made initially, demographic shift, genocide is happening, etc., have been are virtually thrown by the wayside by the international community. So clearly there is pressure on Imran Khan. There is pressure, and so for Mr. Trump to acknowledge that, I think is being just a nice host of Mr. Khan, and being that he's sitting there, an acknowledgement that we understand the issue at hand, and we would like to help. Now I don't think that there is any real assessment of what perhaps that would entail in real terms. But that is not Mr. Trump's strongest of suits. So I think that we will see what happens over the next few weeks.
All right. So Taking off from where Harshvi Pant left, Ambassador, he spoke about how the entire focus of Pakistan's diplomacy is centered around the entire Kashmir issue, and also how, that has been at the center, really, as far as the diplomatic push is concerned. What should India's answer to that be? Should we respond? What should we do internationally and diplomatically?
Well, Pakistan has always been obsessed with the Kashmir issue. Let me add something to what my co-panelists have said about the fact that Pakistan has been showing great keenness to put Kashmir on the agenda for all its bilateral discussions. It is very significant that the readout statement which was issued after the Trump-Imran Khan meeting does not make any mention whatsoever of Kashmir. It speaks only of regional issues having been discussed between the two leaders. So surely the Pakistanis would have wanted to put Kashmir in the readout statement or the joint statement, but the Americans have not gone along with that because the Americans are aware of our sensitivities in this regard. Very significantly, if you heard Donald Trump's statement, he began by talking about trade. He says we'll be talking about trade because there are very important trade issues, etc. Now, trade between Pakistan and the United States is minuscule. America is a very big trading partner of Pakistan in terms of the fact that Pakistan imports a lot from the United States, but Pakistan's exports to US are minimal. So trade is not that big an issue. But the impact on Pakistan's imports and exports on account of its being on the grey list have been very, very significant. So when President Trump was saying that we'll be talking about trade, reading between the lines, I think that Pakistan has been keen to take up at the highest levels its anguish on account of being on the grey list, and this issue naturally flows out of the discussions which Alice Wells, as I said earlier, has been having in Islamabad since Sunday when she arrived, just 3 days. So her discussions centered around two issues, the Afghanistan issue and the question of an agreement with the Taliban for the United States, and also on the question of Pakistan exiting the grey list, because Pakistan is being hurt severely in terms of its economy.
Right.
Pakistan's exports, imports. That's why President Trump said we'll be talking about trade. He is a deal maker. His interests relating to trade, yes, are very significant. But Pakistan is not that big a player in terms of US trade concepts. Now, what should India do, as your question was? I think we should continue to make it clear to the United States and to everybody that Jammu and Kashmir is an internal issue of ours. If Pakistan has any concerns, they will be resolved bilaterally in terms of the Simla agreement. And we should also make it clear that the only remaining issue relating to Jammu and Kashmir which needs to be settled with Pakistan is its illegal occupation of POK. Other than that, we have nothing to talk to Pakistan about. And I think by and large the international community has begun to realize that the noise which Pakistan has been making about Kashmir is totally misplaced. Its friend China has been trying to help Pakistan. Just a few days ago, it sought a meeting, a closed door meeting on Jammu and Kashmir, as we all know, in the United Nations, but nothing came out of that meeting because by and large countries are very convinced that there is no role for them or for the United Nations in the context of Jammu and Kashmir.
Okay, all right. Let's not forget, Professor Soran Singh, that it's an election year for President Trump as well, and he's got several issues back home, the impeachment proceedings that are going on as well. With all of that happening, how much of interest does Trump have really in this region and outside of America?
Very clearly, as you said, in this election year, anything that makes him more visible, makes him more successful, will attract his attention and his efforts. So, for example, he keeps talking about now of trade deals with China, Japan, Korea. He talks about, bringing his forces back home. In fact, you remember when Pulwama happened last year, not just United States, but China, Saudi Arabia, UAE, several voices we heard that they had some role to play in reducing tensions between India and Pakistan. So, because of India's rising footprint and visibility for, let's say, about last 25 years of growth rates, rising footprint of Indian middle class, more recently Prime Minister Modi's diplomatic footwork around the world, India is much more visible today. Issues involving India would have therefore global attention. And anything that can bring global attention to President Trump would attract his attention in that sense. So, Kashmir then becomes interesting for President Donald Trump from that perspective. And challenge lies for India here in perception management, because India is not just more visible, but global media has also become far more, in fact, unprecedented connectivity, unprecedented visibility of global media and influence. And therefore, whatever happens in, let's say, in UK Parliament, or what happens in, comment from Japan or somewhere else, what Wang Yi says in Islamabad, everything comes into debate much more than it would have in earlier occasions. So, while we have to engage President Donald Trump, no doubt, in fact, Indian Prime Minister is one of the few international leaders having good relations with President Trump. While managing those relations, not really giving up on any of the basic principles, for example, sovereignty issues and others. So definitely, we continue to maintain that there is no place for mediation,
Right.
with the clear understanding that starting from 1963, facilitation has been allowed, and all the backdoor entries, conversations of two national security advisors in Bangkok or other places, that facilitation has been allowed over a period of time, starting from the time Jawaharlal Nehru was Prime Minister. So it's not to rule out that United States will have absolutely no role to play in reducing tensions between India, Pakistan and dealing with Kashmir, but whether that will be driven by a sincere sense of providing good offices or by drawing political mileage, India will have to be very careful about those being the drivers when it comes to United States, and make it very clear what is that is acceptable to India and what it is not.
Sure. Professor Pant, because of the entire Afghanistan issue and because of what Trump really wants out of Afghanistan and what he's promised back home, does Pakistan, present a different kind of a challenge for Trump?
It does, and I think that's there has been a constant feature of Mr. Trump's foreign policy, conversations, that he has been trying to do several contradictory things. If you see what from 2017, initially when the South Asia strategy had come, it was all about, in fact, it was about strengthening American presence there. It was about encouraging Indian presence in Afghanistan, and it was coming down very heavily on Pakistan to control terrorism. And I think, to be fair to Trump administration, this has been an administration that has been very tough on Pakistan. I mean, if you look at a number of aspects of Pakistani behavior, and a reason why Pakistan feels so isolated economically and even in terms of economic aid, it is partly because Americans have really tightened the screws under Trump. But the problem, the fundamental conundrum that Mr. Trump faces is exactly the one that we have been discussing, that how do you disengage from Afghanistan without having the support of Pakistan? So initially the idea was that perhaps you can tighten the screws on Pakistan and you can get an outcome. Now I think increasingly the realization, it seems, is that if you want an outcome in a short duration, right, it's an election cycle as we were discussing, and you want to go back to the base and say, hey, I've done what I said I would do, I've taken the troops out of Afghanistan, and this would be seen as a major victory for a president who has very few foreign policy achievements on his plate, then clearly Pakistan's role becomes crucial. And also I think it is important to recall, after the attack on Qasem Soleimani, Pakistan was one of the few countries that Mike Pompeo reached out directly, because I think the recognition is that if something happens in the larger Middle East, then Pakistan will play a very important role in that context. So we are looking at the sort of flux in South Asia and Middle East at this point, driven by a certain electoral calendar of Mr. Trump, will pose pressure on Mr. Trump's policies, which to begin with have been about toughening America's stance on Pakistan and making sure that Pakistan does what it says it would do when it comes to controlling terrorism. So as far as India is concerned, I think India has been relatively well positioned to take advantage of that situation. And if you look at the isolation of Pakistan, both Indian diplomacy on its own and with the help of our partners like Washington have been able to convey a sense that Pakistan completely lacks credibility on these issues and therefore needs to be looked at much more warily than perhaps the world had done in the past. But again, the question is, as we go closer to this sense that now we need an agreement, and I think Alice Wells's presence in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, is a clear indication that the clock is ticking, and the calendar for reaching an agreement is coming very fast.
Right.
Then certainly we might see some greater momentum towards reaching out to Pakistan, towards ameliorating some of those concerns, including a sense that perhaps they understand the issues on Kashmir, and what perhaps America can do in that context, trying to showcase that to Pakistan. But on the ground, I think American bureaucracy, American system, and even Mr. Trump now realize the limits of that approach. So clearly there are limits around which they are going to frame that response. But the central question of Afghanistan will continue to be the albatross around all our necks for at least till the calendar of the electoral cycle is out of our way.
Okay, all right. So that having been said, what is the best way forward? Getting closing comments now from all my guests. I've got 2 minutes left on the program, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, starting first with the Ambassador.
Well, summing up, I think we will not be able to stop President Trump from saying anything because his track record has indicated that. But we also see that of late he has been more responsible in regard to whatever he says relating to India. Now, Trump's interest, as my co-panelists have pointed out, is to get re-elected. Of course, he wants to brave out the impeachment process, but for getting re-elected, he wants to show to his voter base that he's been able to pull out US troops from Pakistan, for which he needs the agreement with Taliban, and in turn for which he needs Pakistan's support.
Right.
So, America needs Pakistan to some extent, and Trump will say nice things about Imran Khan and about Pakistan. Similarly, Pakistan needs the United States to be able to come out of the grey list. I don't think Pakistan really expects Donald Trump to play the role of a mediator, because Trump has said already that he will mediate only if both governments want him to do so.
Right.
But given the geopolitics of the region, both sides need each other and will say things to please each other.
Sure.
And many of the remarks that President Trump made during his pre-meeting press interaction with Imran Khan are in this context.
Okay.
He was just trying to sound nice. He needs Pakistan.
Okay, all right. Professor Saran Singh.
US always needed Pakistan. Indeed, 1954 is the time when they came into alliance relationship. But India's niche advantages have been very different. And I think we continuously should be aware of our niche advantages. Our relationship with the United States has really gone thick and fine now. So it's a very different relationship. And we value that. I suppose so also Donald Trump values India's relationship. The biggest challenge at this stage when it comes to Kashmir in general and what specifically Donald Trump says on Kashmir is perception management for India. I think that's foreign policy's biggest challenge today.
Right.
To be able to explain to almost every stakeholder around the world as to what is India's position. We have done fairly well. India's credibility is very strong on that. Pakistan stands isolated right now. But that's not a job done. That is a continuous work in progress.
Sure.
And I think that is the challenge.
Okay, all right. And Professor Pant, close the show for us with your concluding remark.
Well, I think India has done very well with a president like Donald Trump in office in Washington. Our relations have really been strengthened over the last few years, despite all the things that Mr. Trump had said when he had come to office. And clearly there is a momentum now in the relationship, with even a personality like Mr. Trump cannot derail. The challenge for India remains on the Kashmir, that I think the challenge is largely internal. If we are able to manage Kashmir internally well, then I don't think what Mr. Trump says would matter, or any other American president says would matter in the long term.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.